We were talking about the colloid osmotic pressure and how important it is. So here one more time, colloid osmotic pressure is the pressure exerted by the plasma proteins, or if you have any, the interstitial proteins. Now this here is a significant force versus this one is basically zero. The difference between plasma osmotic pressure and interstitial osmotic pressure is called the oncotic pressure. So here are some numbers for you. The plasma osmotic pressure is significant, 25 millimeters of the mercury. Interstitial osmotic pressure is 0. So here are the forces at play. We are going to have 4 forces. We're going to have hydrostatic pressure in the capillary, hydrostatic pressure in the interstitial fluid. Then we have colloid osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid, which was pretty much 0. And we have colloid osmotic pressure in the blood plasma, which is significant. So these are the forces outward and inward of a capillary bed. When it's all said and done, the forces are not equal. So the outward force is not equal to the inward force. In fact, we have a net filtration pressure of 2 millimeters of the mercury, which means that every time we're going into a capillary bed, we're losing more fluid than we are able to reabsorb. It's a little bit easier to look at the forces here at play in a diagram like this. So here are your forces again. Let's box this in, where let's put some numbers on this here. The hydrostatic pressure in the capillary is, well, it's 37 millimeters of the mercury at first, and then once you're on the venous side, that pressure drops significantly. It's going to be only 17 over here. The colloid osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid is 0 millimeters of the mercury, and then the hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid is small, that's just 1 millimeter of the mercury, and then our colloid osmotic pressure of the blood plasma, that is a significant force of 25 millimeters of the mercury. And up here I put down the hydrostatic pressure in the capillary as it changes. On the arterial side it is 37 millimeters of the mercury, and on the venous side, once we are through the capillary bed and coming out on the venous side, it is 17 millimeters of the mercury. Now let's see how these forces are all adding up. So on the arterial side of the capillary, so we're just going in here with pretty high pressure, and we're pushing blood into this capillary bed, and we have a significant outward force. So we have a net filtration force that's significant. So the forces at play would be here the 37 millimeters of the mercury of the hydrostatic pressure in the capillary at the beginning, and then we're subtracting 0 for the colloid osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid. Then we need to subtract from that any inward forces, and that would be the hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid and the colloid osmotic pressure of the blood plasma. Still, at the end, we're going to have a net filtration pressure of 11 millimeters of the mercury. Now let's take a look at the venous side of the capillary, the venous end. So we're coming out on the other side. We're going back towards the venous side here. So now here we have a net absorption force driving stuff back into the capillary right here. The way it plays out is that now the hydrostatic pressure at the end of the capillary is only 17, has dropped to 17 millimeters of the mercury. Our colloid osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid is still 0. And then we now have a large inward driving force because our colloid osmotic pressure of the blood plasma is at 25 millimeters of the mercury. Hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid is still at 1. If you're adding all of these numbers up, you will find that now our net pressure is minus 9 millimeters of the mercury. That means we're sucking blood, we're sucking fluids back into this capillary. So we have a net absorption of minus 9 millimeters of the mercury. Now 11 minus 9 is 2, and there are your 2 millimeters of the mercury that are basically lost. So this does not add up. What's going out is more than what comes back into the capillary at the end of the capillary. So we have a net filtration pressure. So overall net filtration of 2 millimeters of the mercury, which comes from 11 minus 9 is equal to 2. There you 2. Now what's going to happen? If you're going through your body with your cardiac output of 5 liters per minute, if you're going through your body once, sort of with the 5 liters once per minute, this would add up. These 2 millimeters of the mercury of lost fluids in the tissues, they will add up, and you're going to end up with something that's called edema, unless you find another way of picking up these fluids that you weren't able to recapture. And that's why we have a lymphatic system. The lymphatic system picks up these fluids that you weren't able to recapture and returns these fluids and some of the proteins also back to the circulatory system. So you basically have this blind-ended system of lymphatic vessels that are picking up these fluids, and then they will merge into larger and larger vessels and then return everything back into the on the venous side of the circulation at the level of the subclavian vein. The lymphatic system has some other functions too. We're picking up fats absorbed from the gastrointestinal tract, and then we also filter for pathogens. But right now we're focusing on the fluid return properties of the lymphatic system. So here's your lymphatic system, the anatomy review. These are blind-ended vessels. It's not a circulation. These vessels, they start in the tissues, blind-ended, we call that, and then they merge into larger and larger lymphatic vessels until we hear the thoracic duct is a huge vessel, and then we're going to return whatever we've picked up. We're going to return that here, sort of at the subclavian vein kind of area. Okay, so if you don't have the lymphatics picking up those fluids that you weren't able to recapture, you're ending up with something called edema. 2 main causes of why somebody may have edema listed here. One would be inadequate drainage of the lymph. That could happen that for some reason the lymphatic vessels, they are clogged up. There's a disease, a worm infection that's called elephantiasis, where the worm is lodging in these lymphatic vessels and blocking them, and then these tissue fluids, they cannot be picked up, and so people have these grotesque sizes of their limbs because all of these fluids that are being stuck there. Another reason for edema is that the filtration is far greater than the absorption. So how can that happen? Well, one is if you're increasing the hydrostatic pressure, so that means somebody has high blood pressure. Now you're increasing the hydrostatic pressure, and now you are increasing the force that's driving fluids out of a capillary bed without doing anything to the forces that are bringing the fluids back. So people that have high blood pressure, they have a tendency of having edema. Also, if somebody has a decrease in their plasma protein concentration, well, the one reason for that could be that somebody is peeing their plasma proteins out. If they have a bad glomerulonephritis, their kidneys don't work, and now we're peeing out our plasma proteins, that's when you have a decrease in plasma protein concentration. That would be my first guess if you have somebody in the United States where starvation is not really a problem. When you have somebody come in with edema, I would first look for blood pressure, and then I would look how the kidneys are operating. Also, the liver could be a problem because the liver is making those plasma proteins. If you're working in a country where starvation is a problem, then you might want to look at when somebody has eaten last time, because if you see kids with these hunger bellies, it's not that they have a belly from too much food. It's just that they have edema because their bodies have started to digest the plasma proteins for energy, and now they have a decrease in plasma proteins because they have started to digest these plasma proteins. You could also have an increase in interstitial proteins. That does not usually happen unless you have necrosis of tissue where cells are dying and they're releasing their protein contents into the interstitial spaces. Here's a continuation of our discussion of edema. So basically, here's your definition of edema. It's excessive accumulation of tissue fluids. And again, the edema could be due to high arterial blood pressure. So that means you're going with too much force into a capillary bed. It could be also venous obstruction, that something is pushing back on the venous side, and then leakage of plasma proteins into the interstitial fluid. If there's tissue death, sort of these plasma proteins might leak into the interstitial fluids, or the decreased plasma protein concentration, again, that could be that the liver isn't working right, your kidneys are peeing them out and or filtering them out, which they're not supposed to do, or it could be that your body is in starvation mode and is starting to digest your plasma proteins. And then, of course, the obstruction of lymphatic drainage. That could be, for example, elephantiasis, where you have worms that are lodging in your lymphatic vessels. Here is a picture shown of a little kid where the plasma proteins have been digested. So there's there's the protein malnutrition. Now the tissue fluids start to accumulate right here. This is called a hunger belly. This poor kid, look at how thin the legs and the arms are. These tissue fluids are accumulating because the plasma protein concentration is so low now that you are losing the ability to recapture fluids at the end of the capillary bed. Or to use the fancy terminology, in this case here, the colloid osmotic pressure is too low. Now let's move on to the regulation of blood volume by the kidneys. Of course, the overall volume that's in circulation plays a role on blood pressure and all of the forces, inward, outward forces in capillary beds and your fluid status overall. So now how do the kidneys keep everything in balance? There are 3 hormones that are acting on the kidneys. Number 1, ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Then we have aldosterone. Both of those hormones are very powerful in their ability to return fluids to the body. Both of them will be acting as, well, antidiuretic hormone. It even tells you the name. Antidiuresis means you are recapturing fluids because your blood pressure is too low or your fluid status is too low. So you need to reabsorb as much as possible, and you don't want to lose any kind of fluids. Aldosterone works in the same direction. It's a very powerful hormone for returning fluids, so that the kidneys will basically not get rid of any fluids. There's one hormone that works in the opposite direction, and that's the atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP. That one comes from the heart, and it is released when there's overstretching of the atria, so therefore atrial natriuretic peptide. This one is a little midget. It's a dwarf compared to these 2 giants. These are the main players, and they both are concerned with returning fluid. Because remember, low blood pressure kills you now. High blood pressure, your body isn't really worried about. High blood pressure is the silent killer, kills you down the road. There's wear and tear on the heart, but we're not worried about that because it doesn't kill us now. If you have lost a lot of fluids, and you're losing blood pressure, and that can kill you right now. So ADH and aldosterone are 2 powerful hormones that will return fluids and make sure that your body doesn't lose any additional fluids. Let's first take a look at the regulation by ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Remember, the ADH is made by the hypothalamus and then stored in the posterior pituitary, and it will be released from the posterior pituitary location when the osmolar receptors detect an increase in plasma osmolarity. So that means we are either dehydrated, we have decreased blood volume, which will increase your blood osmolarity, or we have too much salt ingested, so we ate stuff with too much salt, and therefore our blood osmolarity is too high. So now the osmolar receptors in the hypothalamus will measure that, and they will send a message to the posterior pituitary and say, hey, we need some ADH, antidiuretic hormone. We need to dilute basically all the salt, and we have too much salt. The blood osmolarity is too high, and so we need ADH, which acts directly on the kidneys and causes the kidneys to retain water. So we're reabsorbing water. Every drop that comes by there are water channels that are being inserted under the direction of the antidiuretic hormone, and we are reabsorbing every drop of water that comes by there. On the other hand, your hypothalamus will also give you a feeling of being very thirsty. It will it will try to change your behavior, so you feel very thirsty and you're seeking water, and hopefully you can find some water, you drink water, and all together we're going to increase blood volume and decrease the blood osmolarity. So this is how ADH works. By directly inserting water channels into the collecting duct area of the renal tubules, and then we're reabsorbing water, we're also having this feeling of being thirsty